My dad was a minister in Jamaica Plain, which is part of Boston. And when the Second World War came, he was very anxious to fight the Nazis. The Army rejected him because of his physical, but the Navy accepted him. He became a Navy chaplain. By the end of the war, he was a 3-star commander in charge of the chaplains of the European fleet. So when he got back, he had learned that he was good at organizing things. And he went to work for CARE in New York, and then he went to work for the World Council of Churches in Geneva, where he was in charge of the resettlement of refugees for 10 years, basically from 50 to 1960, and helped resettle hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of refugees through the churches. He came to Chicago in 1960 as head of the Church Federation of Greater Chicago and was very much involved in the civil rights movement here. They became close allies with Bill Berry of the Urban League, and working together they were among those. They invited Dr. King for a speech at the Soldier Field in '64, and were among those to encourage Dr. King to come to Chicago for his '66 crusade in 1966. When Mayor Daley gave his shoot-to-kill order after the King riots, my dad and several other clergymen insisted on an immediate meeting. They met the next afternoon, and my dad was the one who spoke up and told Mayor Daley that he had to withdraw that order to the police department. The mayor did so the next day at a press conference. Mayor Daley held that against my father from then on, that he had been preached at by my father. They had been friendly before. Mayor Daley had called him into his office several times just to discuss issues. But now Mayor Daley had, my dad learned, was referring to him as that rioter. That fall, right in '68, Mayor Daley put pressure on some Chicago businessmen, and the leading Chicago businessmen restricted their funding of the Church Federation so that my dad could no longer fund community organizations, for instance. And my dad resigned and went to a similar position in Massachusetts. Then he retired.
Can you tell us about the King riots in 1968?
As folks know, I think, the day after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, by a white man, there were riots in over 100 American cities. Every place where there were black people, they were outraged. The West Side was burning. You could see the smoke from the Sun-Times building in the Loop. You could see the black smoke coming up from the West Side. I ended up writing the story the following weekend about how the riot started, what caused the riot here in Chicago. And I was able to determine a whole series of events that started with one high school on the West Side where the students were unhappy that Dr. King was not receiving the proper respect, and they marched out of their school with the Sun-Times had a full-page picture of Dr. King in the paper that morning, and they wore it proudly on their, many of them on their chests, and they were disciplined. They were like a Dr. Martin Luther King march. They marched to the nearest high school, and the students joined them there, and they went to the next high school and the next. And the fifth high school was Austin, out on the West Side, which had a number of black students, but it was in a white area. And the Chicago police stopped the march. And the police lieutenant fired in the air, fired his pistol, scattered the march, and the angry young high school bitter went down on Madison Street and started breaking windows. They felt, think for a moment, Dr. King had been hit in the head with a rock in a white neighborhood trying to talk about integration. And here these students are just trying to pass through a white neighborhood to get their friends at Orr High School, and they get stopped by the police and a shot fired. They just felt so righteous that Dr. King was being dishonored. So that was the start of the riots, which was really mid-afternoon. But by that night, the whole West Side, virtually every white-owned store on Madison and Roosevelt were burned down.
Can you tell us about the 1968 Democratic Convention?
I was assigned by the Sun-Times to cover the convention, to be responsible for covering the demonstrations aspect of it. So my job was initially who's coming to the convention and why. And basically it was National MOB, it was called, National Mobilization Against the War in Vietnam. It was headed by David Dillinger, a lifelong pacifist. It was to demonstrate as the whole country was up in arms about the Vietnam War. At that time, President Johnson couldn't appear at a public setting without there being demonstrators. It was a big lot of demonstrators. Also coming to the convention were Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they were trying to carry on the Poor People's Campaign. They had a couple mule-drawn carriages to lead the march, which was to start from the Hilton Hotel at noon on the day of the nomination. A third group was the Yippies, Abbie Hoffman and friends, and they planned a counter convention where they were going to elect a Pegasus. I wrote the story, and the editor, Jim Hogue, came around and said, I have it from high intelligence sources that there are dangerous elements coming to the convention, and I want you to put them in the story. And I said, I am not aware of any dangerous elements, and if you are, then you put them in the story. So he did. He added several paragraphs to that story about these dangerous radicals coming. And the only, as a guild member, you have the right to take your name off a story, which is what I did. I took my name off that story, which appeared that Saturday before the convention, and had Hogue's dangerous radicals coming. He also took me off as covering the demonstrations, and instead I would cover the campaign of Senator George McGovern, who was a long shot. There was big trouble Sunday night. The police decided that they were going to clear Lincoln Park, where the yuppies were doing their thing of smoking dope, dancing, having their alternative convention. So at 11 o'clock Sunday night, the vanguard, they were ordered to clear Lincoln Park, which technically does close at 11 o'clock, but it had never been enforced to my knowledge. And the police chased the demonstrators through the streets of Old Town, whacking them with their batons. They didn't just take them out of the park, they were just trying to get rid of them altogether. So the papers the next Monday morning were full of these stories of demonstrators being chased around. The same thing happened the next night, Tuesday. And this time, the police, several policemen took off their name tags, and went directly at members of the press corps, and photographers and reporters, as well as and chased the demonstrators around the streets of Old Town one more night. The reporters, especially the ones that had been beaten, were very upset. Turmoil within the newsrooms. But the editors, the publishers, whatever, wanted to just cool it down. They didn't want to upset anything. The following day, Wednesday, was the nomination, and that was what was important. So the following day, Wednesday, by now, most of the demonstrators who had been in Lincoln Park knew that wasn't safe anymore, and they pretty much moved on to Grant Park. Plus, the march was planned for Grant Park. And that Wednesday afternoon, the police pretty much marched on, attacked again a rally in Grant Park. And again, there you see police beating people. And some demonstrators throwing things back. But the real crisis of the day came that evening, when there were hundreds, probably a couple thousand people lined up ready to start that march on the convention, starting in front of the Hilton Hotel. And the line of march went up Michigan and then into Grant Park and sort of snaked around. There were many distinguished people in that march, including, so the whole area before the Hilton Hotel was packed. And there were also big video cameras strapped to the hotels to show the comings and goings at the Hilton Hotel. Well, I don't remember the exact time, but somewhere around 6 o'clock, a brigade of Chicago policemen charged down Balboa, Michigan, into Michigan Avenue, clearing the intersection. And the video cameras caught that live, and the tapes were shown during the national convention, and which caused an uproar on the convention floor. And those pictures were credited with losing the election for Hubert Humphrey, because these crazy Democrats couldn't even control their own convention or their own people. And in fact, with these pictures of Chicago policemen beating up demonstrators and carrying them to paddy wagons, Senator Ribicoff from Connecticut addressed the convention and said, if George McGovern were president, we wouldn't have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. And the whole, especially the daily forces, and that they were keeping tight control at that convention, were outraged. And that's when the pictures of Mayor Daley shouting at Ribicoff apparently obscenities and anti-Semitic suggestions. So the national audience was treated to these pictures. Meanwhile, the demonstrations were still going on, and the demonstrators realized that they had been on television, and they started chanting, "The whole world is watching, the whole world is watching." And the police, meanwhile, are still going, not to the same frantic pace, but they're still arresting people, trying to clear that intersection. So, the convention itself that night went ahead and nominated Hubert Humphrey to be president. The forces of the McGovern people and the McCarthy people. The McCarthy people had, since McCarthy had won the New Hampshire primary, he was the peace candidate, and he came in second, and McGovern came in third. So that was that. And then the following day, the papers, in the following several days, the major newspapers went out of their way to change people's minds about what they'd seen on television, so including a front page letter from the publisher of the Sun-Times, and then a series of stories about how dangerous the demonstrators had been and what terrible weapons they had threatened the police. Mayor Daley went on national television and told Walter Cronkite in one dramatic moment that his own life had been threatened. So that counter-offensive was very effective, especially nationally. Locally, that Friday night, after the papers had really turned and were not reporting, were taking back what everybody knew was true, there was a meeting of angry reporters in the top room at the Ricardo's restaurant and bar where news people used to hang out. And there were, I don't know, maybe 60, 80 reporters from every newspaper, TV station. All the reporters were upset. What are we going to do when the truth is being distorted? And we decided to form a working press association. And I was elected president of the Working Press Association. And my friend Hank DeSutter was elected to start a journal, a small newspaper that would report the real news, since our papers weren't doing it. And that became a very powerful monthly newsletter that started off by going over the events of the convention. Had the amazing stories that the reporters had not been able to get into their own newspapers. It was a very powerful monthly.
Did you follow up with the Sun-Times and putting the convention in perspective?
It looked like we were going to... Jim Hogue was the new editor. He had become editor over the course of the convention. And he called 5 of us reporters into his office about a week after the convention and said, okay, we're going to set the record straight. I want each of you to write, and we divvied up the stories. Mine, once again, was who came and why. And there was one on the weapons that were used by the demonstrators and whatever. There were 5 different stories. And the following week, the weapons story was carried by Basil Talbot Jr. But then none of the other stories were run. So I asked for a meeting with Jim Hogue, the editor. Went to his office, and I said, I thought we were going to try to set the record straight here. And it's really distorted with all this talk of the radicals, whatever. And he said, Chris, I have it on the highest intelligence authority that the demonstrators were guided by radio from Havana. And I didn't know what to think. Does this man really think that? It was totally off the wall. And my only explanation was there must be the CIA line. It must be the government line. 10 years later, I was working for the Channel 2 News and working on focus reports with Bill Curtis, which were an in-depth look at one particular story of the day. And at the time, news stories could only be like a minute and a half, and we could go 6-8 minutes if we wanted to on a big enough story. So it was a real breakthrough, and we did some really good journalism. But anyway, we did, at the 10th anniversary of the Democratic Convention, we did a series, the 68 convention 10 years later. And during the course of, and we really laid it out day by day, and there was a lot of file footage, and we went through Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. During the course of that, Brian Boyer, my friend, who was also a producer there, interviewed Emmett Deadman, who had been editor of the Sun-Times until Hogue took over during the convention. And Deadman says in that interview that Mayor Daley, shortly before he died, told him over a dinner that President Johnson had planned to come to Chicago and get renominated. That Daley had to tell him twice on the phone that he couldn't come to Chicago. Once when his plane was on the tarmac. That's the way Daley put it. Deadman has since after that edited his book and included that episode in his book about Chicago. Well, if that's true, that changes a lot of things. And it explains why there was that charge down Balboa Avenue to clear the intersection. Because in those days, Johnson would have flown into O'Hare, small plane to Meigs Field, in a caravan to the Hilton Hotel. And it turns out the day before the that Wednesday, the Tribune had run 2 stories about how it looked like Johnson was coming. One of them was an interview with Daley, when Daley was asked, well, how about LBJ? Might he still be in the picture? And Daley indicated that he was. And the second one was about how they had prepared a 5-foot-tall birthday cake for Johnson, and that he'd rented the Imperial Suite at the top of the Hilton Hotel. So then it begins to make sense. Johnson wanted to come in that Wednesday evening for a surprise birthday party. Emmett Deadman had mentioned that. His birthday was around that time. And then as he was being cheered for his birthday, he wanted to be renominated by acclaim. A little research shows that has to be true. In biographies of Humphrey was worried right up until the very end that Johnson was going to jump back in. McCarthy, the anti-war candidate, told his supporters he wasn't going to appear on the convention floor until after Johnson did. And the news media thought he was nuts. They didn't know Johnson was coming, but apparently McCarthy did. And his plan was to interrupt Johnson's plan. And after the birthday cake, McCarthy would enter, and that would break up Johnson's plan to get renominated. So it appears. But in any case, to my mind, the most important conclusion from that is when Johnson's most famous quote, "I will not run, if nominated I will not accept," whatever, that he was probably just lying through his teeth. Or if he wasn't, he changed his mind shortly thereafter. And to my mind, it's suspicious. It casts more suspicion on Johnson. Because after Bobby Kennedy entered the race, all the polls showed that Bobby Kennedy could beat him, that he would be president. So Johnson says he's not going to run. Bobby conveniently gets eliminated. Johnson jumps back in. That's what it doesn't prove that, but it certainly opens the door to that possibility. And a final note on the convention, in the Ken Burns series on Vietnam that aired last year, he does say in that series that Johnson was planning to come to Chicago that Wednesday. But then he says it was because he saw that there was trouble there and he wanted to come and try to help out. Well, that is clearly not what happened. Yes, he was planning to come to Chicago to get renominated. And that's what Ken Burns did not say. Ken Burns also, by the way, gave slanted coverage on the demonstrations. For instance, he acts as if, once again, they're a dangerous radical group. He describes them as marching on the Hilton. Well, they didn't march on the Hilton. They had a scheduled march that was starting at the Hilton. And in fact, if the city had been clever, they would have let that march go south for 8 blocks and stopped it there, and then there wouldn't be anybody in front of the Hilton. But Johnson's secrecy was, to my mind, the biggest problem. Since he didn't want to know, nobody could know he was coming. So, and then all of a sudden, they have to clear a path for him. That's what led to the disaster. That and for the first time, video cameras being used in the news shows.
Dad, tell me about Bobby Kennedy. I know that you had a working relationship with his organization.
On the night that Dr. King was killed, Bobby Kennedy was scheduled to address a rally in the black community in Indianapolis. He had just jumped into the Indiana race to run for president against McCarthy and Johnson, or Johnson's stand-in. And his black audience did not know Dr. King had been killed. And most of his aides said, you really don't want to go into the black community on a night when a white man just killed Dr. King. But Bobby insisted. He went to that black audience in Indianapolis and he broke the news to them. And it is one of the most important speeches, I think, of the 20th century, or most beautiful. And he says, my brother was killed by this kind of an assassination. He quotes Greek poetry, Aeschylus, about the pain we're suffering. You say it was an eloquent speech to that crowd. And of course they were deeply troubled that Dr. King was killed, but they really appreciated his approach. They cheered him. And Indianapolis was the only American city that did not have riots the next day. In any case, shortly thereafter, I was asked to handle press for Northwest Indiana for the campaign. My biggest feat was to get him on the most popular radio station in Lake County, Indiana, which was a country and western kind of station and kind of a redneck host. I led Bobby to that interview through an old deserted kitchen, which really gave me the chills later because Bobby was shot in the kitchen and a month later in California. But anyway, I brought him to the interview, and the host was just overwhelmed that Bobby Kennedy had come to his little studio. And they had a great time in the interview. Bobby just snowed him. On law enforcement, well, he had been, Attorney General of the United States, in charge of law enforcement for years. Bobby was big on pollution, on unions. He just wowed that guy. It was a great broadcast. And they were so proud of it that they reran it the night before the election. So that was my PR best moment for Bobby there.
If you were to say one of the most important days of 1968, maybe December 16th, 1968 in the winter, what other very important event happened that changed the whole outlook of your family and changed everything?
Well, my second son was born. Unexpectedly, I might say. My wife was unable to make it to the hospital, and so my son Bob was born on our bed. I had to chase out the neighbors and a dog to get a little privacy. And fortunately, Bob came out pretty much all by himself. And I lifted him up and put him on his mom's tummy, put a blanket over them. And in those days, there was a medical team that would come around, the Chicago Maternity Center, I think it was called. And I checked with them, and they gave us, you have an hour before you have to cut the umbilical cord. So they arrived and cut the umbilical cord. I should mention too that as the birth process was starting, your mother was telling me to get the Dr. Spock book. I believe that's the child expert. Feverishly, it's in the top drawer, so I was racing to get the book and look up birth. But it all ended up happily, and your mother was very happy to have given birth to you at home.
So as much as 1968 was a turbulent year, at least it ended on probably the highlight of your life, the birth of your second son, Bob Chandler.
One of the highlights.